Thank you very much indeed to everybody who is joining us this evening. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to this lecture in our series, which commemorates the life and career of Walter Morrison as part of our Walter Morrison Festival, which is being coordinated by the Museum of North Craven Life. My thanks go in particular to Dr. Caitlin Greenwood this evening for her technical help, and to the members of the festival organising committee who've done so much to bring the festival to fruition. It's my great pleasure this evening to be able to introduce Dr. Charles Jones, who's our speaker this evening on the topic of why Argentina. Charles is the Emeritus Reader in International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. And his interests are in war, Argentina, and Victorian radical feminism. He read moral sciences and history at Cambridge, where he went on to gain a doctorate on Anglo-Argentine commercial relations up to 1914. He was reader in international relations at Warwick University, where he also gained an MA in philosophy. Returning to Cambridge in 1998, he served for several years as director of the university's Centre of Latin American Studies. In collaboration with Canning House, he's continuing to research into the material and cultural vestiges of the UK's past relations with Latin America. And I'm delighted to say that I can say that he does sing very beautifully with Wolfson College Choir, which he's done since his return to Cambridge. We're very much looking forward to your talk this evening, Charles. Thank you very much indeed for agreeing to join us. We regret very much that we can't do this in person as we had planned, but please do tell us more about Walter Morrison and tell us why Argentina. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Heather, for that generous introduction. I have an awful feeling that you must have heard Wolfson Choir, but yeah, because I don't think that was necessarily in my brief bio on the Polis website. On the subject of singing, of course, it has been an enormous pleasure to get back. And last Saturday, with a different choir, I was able to sing a Bach motet, and it was just tremendous to see the reaction of the audience to live music again. So I am very disappointed to be sitting where I am, rather than up in Giggleswick School, with the prospect of a ride on the Settle to Carlisle Railway tomorrow, which I was looking forward to. Never mind. Now, you know from Robin Bundy's excellent survey of the whole of Walter Morrison's life, those of you who've heard it, that Walter was chairman of an Anglo-Argentine railway. And also, the only other fact is that he has a town named after him, and that the cedar wood in Giggleswick School Chapel came from northern Argentina. So that invites my question, why Argentina? And I'm going to talk a good deal about the Central Argentine, and then move to more general questions that arise out of thinking about Walter and his brother Charles and their relations with Latin America and the Western Hemisphere generally. But I think I have to start because that reference to Canning House, the project we're doing there is called Forgotten Latin America. And of course, the scale of the British connection with Latin America has been forgotten largely. So we have to go back before 1914 to a time when the British invested huge amounts overseas, more than any other nation has before or since. And they did this partly because they already had very established global trading networks that allowed them to spot opportunities outside the UK. And then on the supply side, because the Industrial Revolution, coupled with very generous slave compensation money, had made many people at home very wealthy, and it was to be expected that they would spread risk by wide geographical dispersal of their wealth. You wouldn't put it all in one basket. So the 1914 accumulated stock of foreign investment amounted, and I love this because economists, I'm a historian, but economists like to be precise. And the latest article I've read on the size of the 1914 stock of overseas investment is that it was probably nearer 4 than 3 billion pounds. Precision. And about 10% of that was in Argentina. A note about money before I go any further is that you can try to convert past values into present values by thinking about price inflation, or you can think about share of GDP, which of course has grown hugely. I think for general purposes, if whenever I mention a sum of money, you multiply by 200, it'll keep you awake and it won't be far off. So now all this money is flowing out, and on the demand side, temperate zone countries across the world are attracting land-hungry European immigrants. They're ripe for inward investment, and the largest share of this money from Britain went to the United States. And this is where James Morrison, father of Walter and his brothers and sisters, was very much in the forefront, as early as the 1830s, if not before. Later, the money goes into Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but James is already in the United States before the financial crisis of 1837. I will later refer to a letter that Charles, Walter's eldest brother, wrote from the United States in 1842, when he and Alfred, another of the sons, went out to sort of pick up the pieces a bit of their father's investments in the United States. Now, for Charles, this early experience of the United States, coupled with the Civil War in the 1860s and the financial instability of some of the component states of the federal United States, suggested to him by the 1870s that it was time to hedge his bets and spread out a bit. Argentina at that time looked like a new United States of America. Wool, hides, tallow, jerked beef, preserved beef, were already being exported, and there was clearly potential for cereals. A general financial crisis in 1873, a bit like the 2008 that we've experienced more recently, left a lot of wounded firms in its wake, and they were easy prey for rich City of London capitalists like Charles and Walter. British-born merchants out in Buenos Aires and similar places had been very well placed to get concessions for infrastructure projects like railways or port works. But when it came to it, they really lacked the deep pockets needed to bring these things to fruition. So Charles started to snap up Argentine bargains. And one of these was the so-called Mercantile Bank of the River Plate. It had been set up in the 1870s, it foundered during the crisis, and by 1883, it had been converted into something called the River Plate Trust, Loan and Agency. And it was controlled by a man called John Morris, senior partner in the firm of Ashurst, Morris, Chris, who had been the Morrison family's lawyers since the 1820s. Originally, William Ashurst set the firm up. He and James Morrison worshipped, I use the word loosely because they were Unitarians or something, but they went to the same chapel just north of the City of London at South Place. Now, the River Plate Trust, as I shall call it, became the hub for the provision of a range of services to medium-sized Anglo-Argentine enterprises. They hired expert staff, they organized investment syndicates in London to take up new issues. And by 1894, John Morris, the senior partner, was director of 14 British overseas companies, of which 9 were active in the River Plate republics. Charles, I think, was behind this, but the biographer of James, actually, Richard Gatty, said, and he was a member of the family, said that family tradition was that Charles didn't want to sit on committees of any sort because he had a chronic urinary infection. So it seems that he worked through his lawyers and converted that law firm into a specialist corporate law firm, and of course it still exists today. Now I have a note here saying I'd like the first of my slides to come up round about now, and you'll lose me for a little while. The Central Argentine Railway, here it comes. And my screen says pinch out for a bigger view. But actually, even with the small view, I think you can see that there's something strange about this map. It's Argentine Railways in 1882. And as any of you know the area might expect, they're fanning out from Buenos Aires. But upriver, and the river isn't shown, is the port of Rosario de Santa Fe. There's a reason for this, that up to 1862, the Argentine Confederation and the province of Buenos Aires were separate states at war with one another. So Rosario was going to be the port of the Confederation, as it was called, whereas Buenos Aires was the port of the province of Buenos Aires. Now, although this map is 1882, it bears the scars of that division, because the Central Argentine Railway, of which Walter was later to be chairman, started in 1855, when, and it set out to connect the Confederation's main outlet to the sea, Rosario, with a hinterland that ran up to Cordoba, which is marked, and then right up eventually to Tucumán. This is a historic route that used to lead up to Potosí, which is now in Bolivia, which was at one time one of the biggest cities in the Western Hemisphere, center of silver mining and so on. And originally, the whole point of Buenos Aires and its the region spreading up to Cordoba was to supply food, mules, all sorts of things up to that mining center. So the Central Argentine, starting from Rosario and going towards Cordoba, was in a way from the start a sort of historical route. It had land grants either side to encourage cereal farming and so on. But it was not the place, given the circumstances at the time, than what one might best have chosen to start a railway. And of course, the company was hugely undercapitalized. It had government guarantees of earnings, it had land grants, but even so, it started in 1855, it didn't get to Cordoba until 1870. The onward line to Tucumán, which is marked there, was actually not built by the Central Argentine, it was built by the national government with funds borrowed in Europe, and it was a narrower gauge, so everything had to be moved from one truck to another at Cordoba, which wasn't very efficient. By the time that the line had been finished in 1870, the money had run out and there were virtually no station buildings. One observer in 1868 said that the terminus at Rosario consisted of, I quote, a few disjointed wooden sheds, unquote. So at that point, in the early 70s, they issued £400,000 worth of debenture stock to build some stations, which of course didn't add much to their earnings. And this left them hugely exposed to this mid-1870s crisis, 1873 crisis. And that's the point at which the Morrisons step in, thinking, we've got one here, they're in trouble. And they put Walter on the board as their representative in 1874. And it was a good investment. excellent profits followed, and this enabled them to repay government guarantee payments, which had amounted to about now forgotten, but very substantial payments. And the dividends on the ordinary shares ran at about 6% in the early 80s, rising to an average of 11% in the later 1880s. So they did all right. It wasn't a bad investment. However, it wasn't going to last. And if we move to slide 2, we'll see exactly why. Now that's 1896, but a lot of these railways were built actually in a flurry of enthusiasm in the later 1880s, which ended with a crisis in 1890 that nearly brought down the House of Bearings, which eventually, of course, was brought down by Nick Leeson not so long ago. The other day, actually, I was sorting through papers and I found a letter that I wrote to my cousin Richard, who was a director of Bearings at the time, saying, I know your accounts are all frozen. If you're short of cash, I can bung you a little bit, but I'm not a rich man. Now, what had happened in the interim was that the country had unified in 1862, and a new company, the Buenos Aires and Rosario Railway, had built a line to connect Buenos Aires to Rosario, which they achieved by 1886. And they also continued northwards on a duplicate line up to Cordoba and Tucumán, hemming in the central and taking off all the sort of tributary lines that had come from the west, if you like, onto the old line of the central. It was at this point, actually just a year after the line from Buenos Aires to Rosario was completed in 1887, that Walter became chairman of the Central. But instead of negotiating, I quote, a merger of equals, unquote, which was what was being negotiated or considered at that time, from a position of relative strength, while the Central was still earning very well, he chose to retaliate. And he built a duplicate line from Rosario to Buenos Aires. This rather soured relations with the new Buenos Aires to Rosario company and led to the resignation of the most knowledgeable and locally well-connected of these sort of merchant directors on the board of the Central, a man called Woodbine Parish, who'd been a British consul out there. For a lot of this information, I turned to my former colleague, Colin Lewis, who is the historian of Argentine railways, and I quote him. He said, the Central was poorly led. I quote, many of its directors had only a peripheral interest in the company and were unfamiliar with the Argentine conditions. The Buenos Aires and Rosario board, by contrast, included two leading local entrepreneurs, Thomas Fair and George Wilkinson Drabble, names you won't know, but George Wilkinson Drabble also controlled the railways across the other side of the River Plate in Uruguay. By 1892 then, the Central had lost its grip on northern traffic and fresh merger talks ensued. And it may well be, I'm not sure about this, but I think it was Walter who drafted the so-called detailed memorandum to shareholders of 18th March 1892. But again, nothing came of it. And it wasn't until 1899 that a joint terminal in Buenos Aires was agreed, the Retiro station. And this was followed by a full merger in 1902, where Walter became chairman, but the merger was on much less advantageous terms for the shareholders of the Central than might have been achieved earlier. Now, this little vignette of business history opens up, I think, some broader questions that have preoccupied historians on both sides of the Atlantic and to which William and his elder brother Charles are sort of anecdotally relevant. They don't prove anything, but it's interesting to look at them in these contexts. The first question is, if you like, a microeconomic question about management. And it is, were the Morrisons strategic entrepreneurs or mere rentiers, living the lives of country gentlemen on the interest from a balanced portfolio of corporate and public securities, over the management of which they exerted no control? The second I would call a macroeconomic question about economic development. And this is going to sound a bit blunt, but was Walter an imperialist, ruthlessly exploiting the Argentines, or was he, by contrast, I said I was going to be blunt, a traitor to his own country, declining to invest in British industries of the Second Industrial Revolution, such as electricity, telephones, chemicals, petroleum, while at the same time helping foreigners to develop world competitive grain and meat production that undercut English farmers and contributed to the so-called Great Depression that afflicted them after 1873. Well, these were burning issues in the 1970s when, as a young man, I worked on the history of British international business. The long run relative decline of British industry was being blamed by many people on the gentrification of the country's wealthiest families. They'd all bought up country estates where they aped the manners of the aristocracy into which they'd married, and they proceeded to sit on their fortunes and invest them conservatively. So it was said. The Morrison approach to management wasn't obvious, but I think that they can be absolved of this charge in part because, as I've already suggested, they used the family law firm and this River Plate Trust company to exert a certain amount of control and a lot of influence. And I think here we could go, and I'm sorry, I should have restored my face at some point to keep you entertained. But we now go straight on, I'm afraid, to slide 3. You'll get a glimpse of me later. In fact, we might deal with this quite quickly because this is a table from my, God help me, 1973 PhD thesis. And there's a little sort of insert, which it should read, the corporate clients of Ashurst Morris Crisp in 1895 by area of operations. And of course, they had a lot of British firms, but 2/3 of their clients, more or less, were overseas, and 18 were in Argentina, which is quite a high number. I think we can lose that one, and you can have my face back if you like. Yeah, that's lovely. Well, I mean, I speak for myself. Now, this sort of indirect management style, flanked by Walter's position on the board of the Central Argentine, is consistent with the view that at least in Argentina, the Morrisons had a measure of managerial control over their investments. If we go straight on actually to slide 4, you'll see that there's another layer, another way in which they controlled things. This is probably illegible unless you've got a nice big screen or you can pinch it out. So I will help you a bit. The X's are directorships. The C's, if you can see them, capital C's, are chairmanships. And the top line is the River Plate Trust Owner Agency, with John Morris in the first column as chairman. And there are seven directors altogether. And then what the rest of it does is show that together they had 47 directorships, positions on the boards of the companies listed there, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So together, they've got a pretty good say in the strategic management of a large number of Anglo River Plate companies. And you can see there, if your reading is good, things like down towards the bottom, Liebig's Extract of Meat, who made something a bit like Bovril. A little bit further up, Bickert's Brewery, which was, sadly, it's no longer operating, but it used to be one of the top breweries in Argentina. And going up, you'll see public utilities and railways, but there's the smaller railways are looked after by the River Plate Trust. If we go on to the next one, we'll get a sense of how important the Morrisons were within all of this. And this is, again, I don't know how easy, how big this is on your screen. Yeah, I can actually adjust the size of it with 2 fingers on my iPad. And if any of you are able to do that, you'll see that 2/3 of the way down, we got 2 Morrisons. It's the 2 who went out in 1841 to the United States. Alfred, with investments of 78,000 in 5 companies, and Charles, his elder brother, with 495, get multiplying by 200 here, £495,461 in 21 Anglo River Plate companies. And you will see that he has more by a long shot than any other major individual investor. I can tell you that Barings had more. I don't think there's anyone else possible. There might be one other major institutional investor with more than his $500,000. But no one with the spread across 21. Just out of interest, if you go up a bit, you'll see the Cornet David and Company, Antwerp capitalists who'd been interested in the River Plate for a long time, because a lot of the wool that came from Argentina in the mid-19th century and the tallow and so on went to Antwerp. The wool was used for carpets, low quality wool, couldn't be used in clothing. And they're an interesting example of an Antwerp firm that sort of moves over into the City of London. And as for other individuals, go down to the bottom, and Caitlin is doing a splendid job here. She's going to guide us, I think, with her cursor. And you'll see Henry Tate of Tate and Lyle, and also Wills down there, the next one, the tobacco magnate of Wills Whiffs. Was that just a nickname for appalling cheap cigarettes? I don't know. I think it's actually what they were called. And, you know, they are men who are just, they've got huge wealth and they're spreading it across, but they've got no interest in the River Plate. Whereas Charles, oh, by the way, Walter's not on this because he has 70,000 invested, but only in 3 companies. So together, the Morrison brothers have a huge stake, more than any other family in the country. Now, I think we could lose that for now, the PowerPoint. I've got one more rather challenging table for you, and I thought I'd leave that to the last to sort of test your concentration on a Friday evening. We'll come back to that in a minute. So we've got the apparatus of the law firm that's looking after some of the smaller companies. We've got Walter on the Central Argentine. We've got personal investments. And of course, there is a system of governance, which means if you're an investor and a substantial one, you can speak to the directors. You can go to annual general meetings, you can protest, you can make yourself felt. So all of this I'm just preparing because there is an argument which I'm developing here, about whether these people were entrepreneurs, the Morrisons, or whether they were rentiers, sort of sitting there just raking in the dividends. Now, such evidence as we have, and this is the most time-consuming bit of work I've done for this presentation, although it was very pleasant. I went down because I have worked on the Morrison's archives many years ago. And the archives used to be in black plastic bags in the cellar of a building that had burned down before the First World War. And I remember picking things out, and I on one occasion picked out a dead blackbird. On most occasions I picked out letters or diaries or whatever. But since then it's been organized as a proper archivist. And Caroline Dacres, who's going to speak to you not so long in the future, but she's done huge amounts of work on the Morrisons as collectors, but also she's helped with the organization of the archives, I think. So going down to Fonthill, not Fonthill Abbey, but Fonthill House, it's the adjacent estate, was a great pleasure, particularly because they right next to the estate office there's a really good breakfast place, cafe, in this little village in Wiltshire, which I didn't expect, but absolutely splendid. So I looked at 3 portfolios. One was Charles, and it's a list of all his shareholdings, holdings of bonds, government bonds, corporate shares, debentures, the lot. And it's made up at the time of his death, and it runs to about 11 million quid's worth, multiplied by 200. And it also runs to about 20, 25 pages of fairly closely written, 40 lines a page, something like that. So it's a huge portfolio. The other 2 are both Walter, and one of them is 1911. I don't know why it was drawn up, why it survived. The other is 1922, is to do with his death, where, in both cases, you need to some summary of the investments for probate purposes. Now, the problem with portfolios like that is that they were put together at the end of someone's life, and you would expect that as people get older, they get less bothered about actually managing their investments and tend to normalize. So you'd expect them to begin to converge with the general pattern of British investment overseas, or British investment generally, which was more or less 2/3 at home and 1/3 abroad. If you're looking about cumulative stock of capital invested by 1914. Well, we don't get that, but what we don't get anything that matches up with the sort of 1895 stuff, where, I said Charles had 500,000, Alfred 70,000, Walter 70,000. At that point, if you looked at the whole portfolio, you might find that they are more Argentine than they are later in life. But we can't do that. We haven't got those lists. So I think at this point we have to have this table up, and I'll try to whip through fairly quickly and get it off the screen again, because it's not the easiest of things. And let me just explain it. Charles Morrison, first row. Walter Morrison, 1909. Those can't both be right. I think actually it's Walter Morrison, 1911. Some errors may have crept into this as it was transferred, but don't worry about it. Bring it up. It's all right. I'm not going to change it. I can't see it anymore. Can I have it? Oh, don't say it's, oh dear. Yeah, the next one. Next. That's it. Let's stick with that for a little while. So I'm pretty sure, oh, you changed it. That's miraculous.
I'm so sorry. I thought it would be easier if I updated the date. I didn't realize it was going to cause such a kerfuffle.
Oh, what, did you change it to 1909? No, forget it. It's right now. So Walter Morrison 1911, then Walter Morrison 1922. Now, there are a few things to note about this. The bottom row, the 1914 global stock, is foreign investment. So it's global foreign investment. So it includes American foreign investment in Canada and things like that. So it's a rather dodgy figure, but it's the best I could get. And what you'll see is that most of that foreign investment was in the Western Hemisphere. Most of it is, in fact, British. A lot of it's in the United States and Canada. A lot of it's in Latin America. So I think that's the sort of 16 plus 33. It works. Yeah, amazing. So that's there just for proportion. Now, what you've got to be careful about is that the figures, if we go across the first row, we look at Charles Morrison, the portfolio at that point is 31% in Britain and the rest spread across the rest of the world. That's fine. And the spread of that remaining 69% is represented by the figures 47, 29, 6, so on, going across. But I also wanted to think about the way in which the overseas investment was spread. So the figures in brackets subtract the UK investment and say, let's just look at what percentage of his overseas investments are in different parts of the world. And so you see, he's got 69% in the Western Hemisphere, but most of that is in the USA and Canada. We do have an Argentine figure, which is 9%. We've got all of Latin America, 27%. What I would ask you to note is that there is very little in Asia, and there is very little in Africa. And I would just ask you to reflect, if your historical geography is good enough, on where the British Empire was by 1911. The Morrisons couldn't give a toss about the empire. They are liberals. They're probably rather anti-imperialist, but they're very keen on Western Hemisphere republics, which they see as the future. Now, I went for Charles first, because if you then contrast Walter, you'll see he's got even more in before the First World War in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly very much more in Argentina. And that's more than he should have if he was a rational investor, sort of spreading his money across the globe. And the reason they're both actually sort of over what they should be in Argentina is because they've got power there. And this means, they haven't got any power over the management of all this USA and Canada stuff. That's being run by boards of directors in New York or Boston. So that is what we technically call portfolio investment. Whereas a lot of the Argentine stuff is what we would call direct investment, where there is managerial control. I think we can lose that now. So, some of you may be unfamiliar with this word rentier, French word, and what it conjures up for me is, the French bourgeoisie sitting idly on their money bags with huge investments in state bonds that are 2 or 3%, Yeah, and they have no control at all over this except as individual voters. So what I think we can see from that table is that Walter and his brother Charles were both, in some part of their portfolio was portfolio investment over which they had no control. But the bits that were overrepresented, where they had sort of more money than they should, they had it there because they did have control. The difficult thing is that Walter didn't actually do a terribly good job with the Central Argentine. I mean, he should have got this merger going 10 years before he did. It wasn't on the whole a great story of success. Charles, through the River Plate Trust, did rather better. And I think we have to accept, I'm sorry about this because we're commemorating Walter, but it seems to me that Charles was definitely the better businessman of the two. And the reason for this, I think, is that he saw in the 1837 crisis, a young man, he's then sent out to the United States, as I said earlier, in 1841. And he immediately cottons on to what you got to do. And he writes back to his father. And this is an 1841 letter, and I quote it. "The rich men in this country," brackets, I mean those who continue to be rich, make a business of their investments. They have an office, keep accounts, become directors in a company whenever they invest in its stock, attend the hours of business in Wall Street, know of everything which is stirring, and as far as possible, do everything themselves. A capitalist who will submit to these conditions may invest his money in the United States as safely as in Europe and at a much higher rate of interest. One who will not will have the very eyes picked out of his head by the vultures, who are always ready to pounce on everything which is left unwatched and unprotected. Well, Charles, his main country estate was at Basildon, near Goring Gap. He was close to the city. He was observed even in old age, going around the city every day, visiting firms, on quarter days, collecting, the coupons. You had to produce a physical coupon to get the payment on government bonds and so on. I imagine a bodyguard followed discreetly behind. Walter became, I think, more of a country gentleman. Good for him. I mean, he did a lot of good up in the Northeast. And I think I should be fair because someone's bound to object. I think he was probably a direct investor in a lot of Northeastern firms and sat on their boards and so on. But he was not the attentive manager of business that his elder brother Charles was. And then I come to the final thing, and it's time I did actually, because I don't really want to bang on too long. And this is the issue of imperialism or betrayal. Argentines, and I did look at who's here, and I was disappointed not to see any obvious Argentine names. I thought, there might be people from Morrison. The Argentines from the 1920s onwards, particularly, even a bit earlier, there's always been a nationalist strand which has said, you British, you constructed an economy that was to your advantage. It funneled stuff out to you, meat and wheat, and it was jolly useful for you. But it meant that when we came to the 1930s, we were completely in the, I won't complete that, but we were in trouble. And after the 1930s, they said, well, we'd better industrialize and have a more balanced economy because we think it's always going to be a source of vulnerability to be exporting these primary products whose prices are very volatile and so on. That turned out to be fairly disastrous because the country didn't have a big enough internal market to justify one time something like 20 vehicle assembly plants in the 60s, 70s. And frankly, the Argentine economy has not been well managed since about 1917, 16, I think. So this accusation that the the Morrisons and other foreign investors were wicked imperialists, exploiting the Argentines, I think falls foul to the rather splendid saying of one of Cambridge's Marxist economists of an earlier generation, Joan Robinson, who pointed out that the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. The Argentines did jolly well out of this export economy. In the 1920s, they had something like the 4th or 5th highest per capita income in the world and one of the biggest fleets in the world. And they were on the way to being the United States. They just didn't quite make it. Partly, and this is a digression I will not go into now, partly because the United States recognized them as a competitor and branded them as fascist collaborators in the 1940s, rather unfairly, not entirely, and really sort of drove them into an attempt at self-sufficiency and industrialization. There was, what did I say? Oh, yeah, the contrast was between imperialist and traitor. And there I refer, of course, to these criticisms that were mentioned by, what's the name, Robin Bundy in his general survey, where some locals said, well, you put all this money into helping Argentina become an efficient producer of cereals that undercut local farmers. So, what's that all about? You've damaged the local economy. To that, we have to add the more general argument about foreign investment and being a sort of dereliction of duty by British capitalists who should have been helping Britain to go into the second industrial revolution, all engines firing, as it were, and maintain competitiveness with Germany and the United States. The trouble with this argument, it seems to me, is that I can't see that there is any legal or even moral obligation on wealthy people to act in the national interest of the country they happen to live in. It's up to governments, and I wish they would, to make sure that people do pay their taxes in the right jurisdiction and bring them to book generally. But it's not up to the men themselves or the women. And I think Charles and Walter acted entirely rationally and in the interests of the family, because of course, they had women, Ellen and other sisters and nieces and so on, who depended on them. And they acted in the best interests of the family and themselves. There is, I think, another aspect to this. I just touch on this before closing, which is that when you look at the charge of imperialism, if you like, you have to bear in mind, and also the sort of neglect of the British economy, you have to bear in mind that they were the sons of a radical James Morrison. And William Ashurst, who set up the Ashurst Morris Crisp legal firm, was a real radical. He was a feminist, as I think was Walter, in favor of women having the votes, middle-class women, obviously. Ashurst was an abolitionist. His children were very closely involved, and the firm was, the law firm, in, what we would today call terrorism. That's to say, Republican insurrections against Austrian rule in northern Italy. So these are people on the left of British politics. Now, I think it fades because, James was a self-made man. Walter was Eton and Balliol, and it has an effect. He softens. And finally, in 1886, he is one of those who crosses the floor, voting against Gladstone's Home Rule Bill. And this is the point at which the Liberal Party splits, and the Liberal Unionists who cross the floor in 86 finally end up in the Conservative Party. So it is the sort of crucial moment when British liberalism dies, to put a better word on it. There is an extraordinary resurgence in the early 20th century, but actually it's gone. And why I mention this is that the bias towards the Western Hemisphere is a bias towards republics. And I think that the Morrisons believed in the Western Hemisphere as a less corrupt world, a new world, with republics. And they also invested very much in urban utilities. They didn't invest in plantations. They didn't invest in mining, two areas where labor was, hyper exploited. So I think, far from being imperialist, they were actually, how shall I say? They felt, and this is in a way a tragedy, they felt that they were developing a new world. But of course, what eventually happened was that there was a nationalist reaction against this foreign control in the New World, which led eventually to Juan Domingo Perón in the 40s, the nationalization of all the Argentine railways, etc., etc. Now, all of these reflections, I suppose, or some of these reflections may reveal that, of course, this interest in Anglo enterprise, River Plate enterprise of mine stems from a very early point in my academic career. And I should close by saying I'm really very grateful to the organizers of the Morrison Festival for their invitation to speak to you tonight about Walter's Argentine connection. Because it's renewed my interest in the Morrisons at a very timely moment, just as I'm near to completion of a biography of the youngest daughter of William Ashurst, James Morrison's lawyer, who in her later life was known as Madame Venturi, and who ran a salon in the King's Road, Chelsea, where she entertained a lot of Irish nationalist MPs, and also the painter Whistler and the poet Algernon Swinburne. And the next generation of Ashursts had kept in touch with their father's successors in the family firm. It's now known simply as Ashurst, and it's celebrating its bicentennial next year. But the Ashursts hadn't really kept any links with the Morrisons. And I want to leave you with just a brief moment in 1857, not long after the deaths of both James Morrison and William Ashurst, when Giuseppe Mazzini, the Italian Republican, strapped for cash, which he needed for the next insurrection against the Austrians, wrote to Emily Ashurst, Emily Venturi as she was, no, she wasn't by then, Emily Ashurst, with what seems to me to have been possibly an instruction. 1857, I think Walter was still at Oxford, young man, 20, 21, something like that. And Mazzini wrote, I quote, "Is there not a benevolent young lady who would flirt a little for my sake with the son of Morrison, who does nothing with his money, and who could give some 2,000 to me, just with the same inconvenience I have from giving away 2 shillings? I think he must have had Walter in mind. And Walter indeed did subscribe to some radical causes. He twice subscribed later to funds got up to support the notorious radical autodidact George Holyoake in his impecunious old age. But on the whole, the political enthusiasms of the father are not inherited by his sons or daughters, nor, I think, was flirtation very much up Walter's street. One thing I do feel about that quotation is that I bridle slightly at Mazzini's claim about the son of Morrison who does nothing with his money. I think we've established that he did quite a lot with his money in the way of actually becoming what I'm going to call is a sort of oxymoron, a strategic rentier. Yes, a lot of it he just invested, left it. But the Argentine money, I think, by both Charles and Walter, was what we would call direct investment that was to some extent controlled by the investors. And I'll leave it there, and I hope, I'm sorry I've spoken as long as I have, but I hope there'll be some questions, and I'm very happy to stick around as long as possible. My only sadness is that I'm not going to be on the train from Settle to Carlisle tomorrow, which I was looking forward to, but I'll do that another time. Thank you.